The longhouse roared with horns and song as winter's first storm clawed the shore. Eirik kept to the firelight, jaw set against old whispers. Bjorn said, "Drink, brother, the gods blink tonight." Eirik said, "The gods do not blink, they judge." Jarl Sigvald rose with a wolfskin mantle and a smile that cut. Sigvald said, "A thief sits among us, and honor bleeds." The hall stilled as shields hummed with wind. Liv glided near the high seat, eyes bright as cold iron. Liv said, "Truth hides in the shadow of trust." Astrid watched from the smoke, fingers tracing ash signs. Astrid said, "Storms reveal more than they break." Sigvald slammed a knife into the table and named Eirik. The crowd gasped like surf over stone. Eirik said, "Name the deed or carry the shame." Sigvald said, "The sacred torque is gone, and envy eats your heart." Torches spat, and the rafters groaned like waking gods. Eirik stood, and the hall felt smaller than his breath. Morning bled grey over the fjord, as Eirik staggered from the longhouse with his honor in chains. Bjorn followed to the yard, voice low with fear and faith. Bjorn said, "Say the word, and I stay." Eirik said, "You live if you leave." Crows wheeled over surf cracked with ice. Astrid stepped from the fog, staff biting frost. Astrid said, "Truth walks slow, but it arrives." Eirik said, "Truth was dragged to the fire and burned." From the ridge, Sigvald's horn called judgment that could not be swallowed. Liv watched unseen by the gate, eyes set like a locked door. Liv said, "He must break to bend." Eirik shouldered his pack and the weight of a stolen name. Snow whispered across the track as if the gods were speaking in ash. Eirik said, "I will return with answers or not at all." The fjord answered with the hollow clap of distant ice. By noon the cliff road snaked above black water, and the storm pressed like a hand on the world. Eirik walked the edge where wind tried to claim his steps. Bjorn said, "The path hates the bold." Eirik said, "Then it knows me." Ice fractured along the rock like veins under skin. Astrid paced behind, marking signs in the drift. Astrid said, "The torque's hunger stirs older hungers." Eirik said, "Sigvald feasts on doubt and calls it law." A gull screamed, then vanished into white. From a switchback, Liv appeared beside a thorned pine. Liv said, "A safer trail winds east if you trust me." Eirik studied her face as if it were a blade's edge. Bjorn said, "We trusted once and bled." The sea boomed below, counting heartbeats no one could spare. They found shelter in a sea cave where the tide gnawed stone into ribs. Fire kindled, and shadows shivered like living runes. Bjorn said, "If Sigvald forged the lie, why now?" Eirik said, "Because fear fattens in winter." Astrid ground herbs, their scent bitter as old truth. Astrid said, "The torque binds oath to envy, and someone fed it." Liv set dried fish near the flames with patient hands. "And if so?" Liv said, "Eat, then choose a road, for storms do not wait." Eirik watched the entrance like a hunter listens to night. He measured each breath against memory, and came up short. Bjorn said, "Say we walk east, what then?" Eirik said, "Then we face what waits and call it by name." The tide hissed, and the cave answered with a damp heartbeat. Night tightened its grip as the storm cleared to a sky of hard stars. On the headland, stones ringed an old altar where salt and blood once spoke. Astrid said, "Swear here, and the sea will hear." Eirik set his palm on cold rock and felt the years stare back. Bjorn said, "I stand with you, even if the ground opens." Liv watched from the edge, a shadow carved by moonlight. Liv said, "Oaths bind more than wrists." Eirik said, "Let them bind my fear first." He named the thief that ruled the hall, and promised a reckoning clean as iron. The surf rose and bowed, as if the fjord itself approved. Astrid said, "The gods envy those who rise without their leave." Eirik lifted his hand, and the stars did not blink. Dawn sharpened the fjord into steel, and Eirik stood by the shoreline where waves chewed ice. His reflection broke in ripples that mocked his scars. Bjorn said, "Your silence grows heavier than mail." Eirik said, "Words weigh less than truth withheld." Astrid moved among driftwood, scattering salt for warding. Astrid said, "Dreams worn of chains not forged by men." Eirik said, "Then it is envy that binds tighter than iron." A crow settled on the prow of a broken boat, wings black as omen. Liv approached from the mist, her voice smooth as frost. Liv said, "Chains can be keys, if you learn where they turn." Bjorn said, "Her riddles carve wounds of their own." The tide surged, whispering in tongues older than speech. Eirik said, "The gods envy the living, yet they watch with hunger." The horizon bled pale fire, and every shadow stretched toward him like memory. The trail bent inland through pine, where frost jeweled branches like blades. "Eirik," Bjorn said, "the trees keep secrets better than men." Eirik said, "Then may they keep mine until the end." Astrid's staff left marks in snow, binding whispers to the earth. Astrid said, "The land remembers every oath broken." From the shadows, Liv's eyes gleamed as if catching fire not yet lit. Liv said, "Memory burns longer than flesh." Eirik brushed frost from his brow, heart beating like war drums. Bjorn said, "I fear you will break before we find our road." Eirik said, "I broke long ago, now I walk on shards." A wolf's howl drifted over the ridge, thin and cold as a blade across skin. Astrid said, "Wolves do not howl at prey unless envy blinds them." The pines groaned, and the snow muffled their fear. By midday, raiders spilled from the ridge with axes, flashing like struck stars. Bjorn said, "Steel greets us before bread." Eirik drew his sword, fire in his veins. Eirik said, "Then let steel feast first." Blades rang in the clearing as snow turned red. Astrid raised her staff, chanting to steady hearts. Astrid said, "Stand or fall, the earth takes all the same." Bjorn fought at Eirik's side, shield biting splinters. Bjorn said, "The gods test us with each swing." Liv darted like a serpent, her dagger singing, eyes never fixed on friend or foe. Liv said, "Blood reveals what oaths cannot." Eirik cut through a raider, sweat mixing with frost, and the howl of wolves echoed. He said, "Let envy choke on courage tonight." The field froze in silence when the last foe fell. When night fell, the fire crackled low, smoke clawing at the stars. Eirik sat apart, blade across his knees, gaze lost in the edge. Astrid said, "Steel remembers what hands forget." Eirik said, "It remembers blood, not truth." Bjorn leaned close, warmth of friendship against cold silence. Bjorn said, "You carry guilt heavier than wounds." Eirik said, "Guilt sharpens until it cuts deeper than iron." Liv rested against a log, shadows weaving across her face. Liv said, "Shame feeds envy, envy feeds wrath, and wrath feeds gods." Astrid's eyes glimmered with ancient grief. Astrid said, "The gods envy men because men can choose." The fire cracked, sparks rising like lost souls. Eirik said, "Then choice is the only weapon I keep." The wind agreed with a mournful whistle. Before dawn broke, whispers of ash drifted into the camp like smoke from unseen fire. Astrid stirred with a warning in her throat. Astrid said, "The torque stirs, even in sleep." Eirik said, "Then envy dreams louder than men." Bjorn strapped his shield, face pale, in firelight. Bjorn said, "If curses ride wind, they have already found us." Liv rose silently, her hair lit faintly by embers. Liv said, "Curses do not find, they are invited." Eirik gripped his pack and the iron at his side. Eirik said, "Then I will invite it to my blade." The horizon bruised with red, as if the sky itself bled. Astrid said, "Blood, spilled by envy stains more than earth." The silence after her words carried heavier than the cold. Snow hammered the village while Jarl Sigvald stood on the hall steps like a black mast. He raised the torque, and the crowd swayed as if pulled by a tide. Jarl Sigvald said, "Order returns when envy kneels." A farmer flinched, and guards dragged him forward. Jarl Sigvald said, "Theft breeds hunger, and hunger feeds wolves." The knife kissed the man's earthen tunic, cutting only fear, not flesh. Laughter broke like ice, thin and dangerous. Liv watched from the shadow of a pillar with eyes that measured cost. Liv said, "Mercy buys silence, but not loyalty." Jarl Sigvald said, "Loyalty is paid in iron." He set new laws like stones across a river, hard and cold. Smoke curled from the longhouse roof as if the gods exhaled displeasure. The torque gleamed with a sickly light that bent the torch glow. Liv said, "Crowns can choke the throat that wears them." Jarl Sigvald said, "Then let it choke others first." The wind howled and doors slammed like verdicts. Eirik led the way through scrub and drift where the land broke into scarred ridges. Raiders burst from a gully with shields chalked in crude runes. Bjorn said, "They hunt fear more than coin." Eirik said, "Then starve them." Steel caught daylight and hurled it back in sparks. Astrid planted her staff, voice steady as bedrock. "Astrid," said, "hold the line, and the earth will hold you." A hammer slammed Bjorn's shield and numbed his arm. Bjorn said, "I have another arm, and 2 good legs." Eirik cut down the hammerman and stepped into the gap. Liv ghosted along the flank, blade quick, eyes quicker. Liv said, "Break the tail and the head will doubt." The raiders faltered as if a string had snapped. Eirik said, "Leave one to run with a tail we choose." Silence returned in shivers, broken by ragged breath and the slow drip of thawing blood. They found a cleft in the cliffs where sea spray clung like breath to stone. Inside lay a shrine of whalebone and iron nails, old as drowned kings. Astrid said, "Here the living bargained with storm." Eirik touched a rusted ring, and the cold went deeper than skin. Bjorn said, "I would rather fight 10 raiders than one whisper." Liv traced carvings that spiraled like tide marks on memory. Liv said, "The torque was forged to leash envy, not crown it." A faint hum rose, thin as a mosquito, yet heavy as guilt. Astrid said, "Blood once sealed this mercy and turned it into hunger." Eirik said, "Sigvald feeds it with fear and calls it law." The air smelled of brine and iron, and the light shook like a net in waves. Bjorn said, "If we free it, who pays the debt?" Eirik said, "Debts end where truth is spoken aloud." The shrine held its breath as if waiting to be named. Night wrapped the cliff path in velvet and knives. The fire was small, a coin of light in a vast purse of dark. Liv sat close enough that Eirik could count the embers in her eyes. Liv said, "You wear guilt like armor, and it slows your hand." Eirik said, "I wear it so I remember where I failed." She passed him a strip of dried fish and a sharper thought. Liv said, "Sigvald named you thief because he feared your name." Eirik said, "Fear shapes lies into crowns." Bjorn rolled in his cloak, pretending sleep with a tired smirk. Astrid watched the stars as if they were old debts. Astrid said, "Temptations come as counsel when the road forks." Liv said, "I offer a map, not a fork." Eirik said, "Maps can lead into the same sea." The fire cracked, and sparks climbed like prayers that knew their aim. Before dawn the world held its breath like a hunter drawing string. Frost limbed every twig and made the path glitter with quiet malice. Astrid touched the ground and flinched as if it hissed. Astrid said, "Betrayal walks ahead of us with soft feet." Bjorn said, "Name the feet and I will break them." Eirik said, "We break the snare, not the messenger." Liv's shadow stretched long and thin across the snow. Liv said, "Shadows tell lies when the light is afraid." Far off, a horn trembled the air like a cracked bell. Astrid said, "Sigvald calls with the voice of the torque." Eirik said, "Then we answer with the voice of our oath." Bjorn said. I prefer the voice of iron. The sun did not rise so much as admit defeat behind cloud. Eirik tightened his cloak and set his jaw where doubt would not find purchase. The great hall thundered as Jarl Sigvald spread his arms wide beneath dragon-carved beams. Torches smoked, filling the air with the smell of pine and iron. Jarl Sigvald said, "The clans bend or break. Their oaths belong to me now." Men shouted approval, though fear salted every cheer. The torque glittered against his chest, sickly in the torchlight. Liv stood by the dais, face smooth as frost, eyes veiling storm. Liv said, "Oaths written in fire last longer than carved stone." Sigvald sneered, "Fire eats all, and still the smoke rises to me." The crowd roared, yet unease rippled through the benches like rats in grain. Outside the blizzard moaned as if the gods themselves rattled at the doors. Sigvald slammed his fist and sparks leapt. Jarl Sigvald said, "I alone bear the envy of the gods, and I alone shall rule." The night groaned with a promise that power costs more than gold. Snow rattled the mountain pass as Eirik pressed forward, cloak stiff with frost. Bjorn said, "We walk into the wolf's throat, and you call it a road." Eirik said, "Every road ends in teeth. Better to choose where we are bitten." Astrid planted her staff into ice, her breath steady as stone. Astrid said, "A storm hides more than sky. It hides truth men fear to see." Liv's shadow brushed the rock face as she matched their pace. Liv said, "Truth waits in Sigvald's hall, but so does the snare." Bjorn muttered, "I would rather fight storms than men who smile while cutting throats." Eirik said, "Storms do not envy, men do." The wind clawed their faces, and the peaks howled like beasts chained by the gods. Their steps carved scars into snow, each one deeper than the last. In a narrow valley they found a cairn of bones, crowned with rusted shields. Astrid touched the stones and flinched as if burned. Astrid said, "A family secret is buried here, one that bleeds still." Eirik bent, tracing runes carved in haste, his jaw clenched. Eirik said, "My father's name stains this stone. Sigvald made me exile long before the feast." Bjorn said, "If this is truth, then he cut you twice. Once in blood, once in name." Liv brushed snow from a shield, eyes flicking like a hawk's. Liv said, "Secrets wield sharper edges than swords." Eirik's hands trembled, though the cold had nothing to do with it. Astrid said, "Envy was planted here, and envy will bloom again." The wind carried a sigh that might have been the bones remembering. By firelight in a cliff cave, Astrid's voice trembled like wind through hollow reeds. Astrid said, "The torque is no jewel. It is a hunger that feeds on envy." Eirik stared into flame, reflection fractured by sparks. Eirik said, "Sigvald knew. He fed it with fear and called it law." Bjorn clenched his fists, heat of anger burning. Bjorn said, "Then he chained a people with their own doubts." Liv leaned close, voice softer than smoke. Liv said, "Chains can be broken, if one dares bleed." Astrid closed her eyes, whispering a chant lost to age. Astrid said, "The gods envy what they cannot bind." Eirik lifted his sword and held it over the flame. Eirik said, "Then I will burn envy itself from the chain." The cave shuddered with an echo that did not belong to men. The next morning frost glittered on the ridge, and Eirik stood where the path fell toward the valley of war. Astrid said, "You were not cast out for theft, but for fear of what you might become." Bjorn said, "He envied you even as he named you brother." Liv's eyes narrowed, unreadable as she studied the horizon. Liv said, "Truth is a blade, and blades cut both hands that hold them." Eirik said, "Then let mine cut the chains Sigvald forged." His voice carried into the ravine, echoing like a vow carved into stone. Astrid rested her hand on his arm, steady and solemn. Astrid said, "Envy stirs the gods now, and they watch." Bjorn set his shield, a grin fierce as winter's sun. Bjorn said, "Let them watch. I fight for the living." The ridge shook with a wind that felt like judgment. The ridge opened to a valley where ravens circled, their cries sharp as iron. Eirik stood with frost in his beard and storm in his eyes. Bjorn said, "Truth weighs heavy, yet you carry it like a shield." Eirik said, "It cuts more than it guards, but I bear it still." Astrid traced her staff over the ground, runes glowing faint. Astrid said, "Sigvald twisted your fate before the gods could speak." Liv's cloak snapped in the wind, her gaze sharp as broken glass. Liv said, "Twisting fate is the only way to wield it." Bjorn gripped his shield tighter, defiance burning. Bjorn said, "Fate bends, but it will not break us." Eirik lifted his sword toward the horizon, where smoke rose from Sigvald's hall. Eirik said, "Then I choose the road where envy meets iron." The valley groaned like the earth itself had heard. In the clearing of fallen pines, Bjorn knelt, swearing with fire in his voice. Bjorn said, "Where you fall, I fall. Where you rise, I rise." Eirik placed his hand on Bjorn's shoulder, eyes shadowed with gratitude. Eirik said, "Your oath binds us stronger than any chain." Astrid whispered a blessing, her words carried on the smoke of burning bark. Astrid said, "Oaths sworn under sky endure longer than stone." Liv watched with folded arms, her lips pressing doubt into silence. Liv said, "Oaths taste sweet, but they sour when tested." Eirik faced her, voice steady as iron. Eirik said, "Then let them sour on my tongue, not his." Bjorn grinned, fierce and unyielding. Bjorn said, "I will not sour, I will burn." The trees cracked, and the air smelled of storm. The sea raged as their boat fought the storm, waves towering like walls of iron. Bjorn roared against the thunder. Bjorn said, "The gods cannot drown men already drowning in truth." Eirik gripped the tiller, teeth bared. Eirik said, "Hold fast or envy claims us before Sigvald does." Lightning split the sky, carving shadows on Astrid's lined face. Astrid said, "Storms test not bodies but souls." Liv clung to the prow, hair whipped by wind, eyes fierce. Liv said, "Even envy drowns when waves are higher." A mast cracked, splinters slicing through rain. Bjorn hauled rope with bleeding hands, defiance carved deep. Eirik said, "We cross or we sink, but we do not turn back." Thunder answered like gods pounding drums of war. The storm passed, leaving the shore littered with wreck and salt. Liv stood on the sand, gaze fixed inland where torches burned like eyes. Liv said, "Sigvald waits, and I will lead you to him." Bjorn spat brine, his hand clenching his shield. Bjorn said, "Why should we trust a tongue that has betrayed before?" Eirik raised his hand, stopping the quarrel. Eirik said, "Because the path to Sigvald lies through lies themselves." Astrid's eyes shimmered with unease. Astrid said, "A serpent can guide, but it coils even as it leads." Liv smiled thin as a blade. Liv said, "Follow, or face the marsh where men vanish like smoke." Bjorn growled, but his feet moved anyway. Eirik said, "We choose the serpent, for the wolf waits ahead." The firelight inland grew brighter, calling. Torches marked the ridge above, and warriors stirred in shadow. Suddenly Astrid thrust herself between Eirik and the path, staff blazing with runes. Astrid said, "Go, I will hold the night from you." Eirik's throat tightened. Eirik said, "I will not leave you to fall alone." Astrid smiled with sorrow. Astrid said, "All mentors must pay for the wisdom they give." Bjorn said, "Then I will die with her." Astrid slammed her staff, shaking the ground. Astrid said, "No, your road is still ahead, mine ends here." Liv's eyes glimmered, as if lit by unseen flame. Liv said, "Sacrifice tastes sweeter than loyalty." Eirik gripped Bjorn's shoulder, voice heavy. Eirik said, "We honor her by walking forward." The air cracked with runes, and Astrid's chant drowned the sound of torches. The marsh steamed under a bruised dawn while reeds whispered like knives on silk. Eirik faced Liv where black water mirrored their breath. Liv said, "You came to break a chain, yet you forged your own." Eirik said, "Chains of oath are not the same as chains of fear." Her smile cut thin as frost on glass. Liv said, "Sigvald promised a world without doubt if I opened the door." Eirik said, "He promised a cage with brighter bars." Wind pushed the mire into ripples that looked like runes. Bjorn stepped between them, shield low, heart high. Bjorn said, "Choose us, or name yourself our wound." Liv's gaze flinched, then hardened like quenched iron. Liv said, "Wounds teach faster than kisses." Eirik said, "So be a lesson that ends tonight." The marsh swallowed a distant horn as if fate had no more patience. They reached the ridge above the hall as horns raked the morning. Jarl Sigvald strode from the gate like a storm wearing fur. Jarl Sigvald said, "Bring me the exile who mistakes doubt for virtue." Bjorn laughed with iron in his teeth. Bjorn said, "I brought myself to spoil your feast." Spears bristled, and ravens stitched black lines across the sky. Eirik said, "This ends where you began it with a lie." Sigvald raised the torque, and the light around it bent as if shamed. Jarl Sigvald said, "Kneel, or envy will kneel you." Liv watched from the flank, lips pressed to silence that bled. Bjorn stepped forward, shield high, feet planted like roots. Bjorn said, "I will crack your crown with the truth of my friend." The yard shook with boots and breath, and the old scent of fear. Steel sang, and the world narrowed to edges. Eirik moved like a tide that had learned patience from rock. Jarl Sigvald said, "The hall is mine, the gods my witness." Eirik said, "Let them watch you fall." Sigvald struck first, heavy and sure, blade biting sparks from Eirik's guard. Bjorn crashed into a ring of shields, roaring a hymn of broken wood. Bjorn said, "Make room for a reckoning." Liv slipped between fighters, eyes hunting for a choice that could live. Eirik turned to cut and carved truth along Sigvald's arm. Jarl Sigvald said, "Pain teaches faster than law." Eirik said, "And truth outlives both." Snow churned into gray mud that smelled of iron and winter. Their blades circled, the hall listening like a beast afraid to breathe. Thunder crawled over a sky that had forgotten mercy. The torque flared and torches bowed like servants. Jarl Sigvald lifted it high, and the air thickened with a taste of coins and salt. Jarl Sigvald said, "Envy is a river, and I am its floodgate." The ground trembled, and voices not born of lungs hissed from rafters. Bjorn staggered as fear knifed his breath. Bjorn said, "It speaks in my bones." Eirik stepped toward the light that wanted to be worshipped. Eirik said, "You envy men who stand without crowns." Liv cried out as the torque drank the rune's courage. Liv said, "It feeds until only ashes choose." Eirik drove his blade into the beam, splitting the flame's command. The sky answered with a crack that broke the storm's spine. Silence fell hard, and smoke wrote slow letters above the fight. Sigvald knelt, blood threading his wrist like a red promise. Jarl Sigvald said, "Strike and become me." Eirik stood over him, breath steady, rage tired. Eirik said, "I will not wear your hunger." Bjorn planted his shield like a gravestone between them. Bjorn said, "Mercy given is a debt collected by time." Liv stepped closer, voice low as snowfall. Liv said, "Kill him, and the torque will choose your name next." Eirik lifted his blade, then set it across the torque. Eirik said, "Let envy die before either of us." He crushed the gold under iron until the light gutted out. Jarl Sigvald wept a sound that did not belong to a ruler. The hall exhaled as if allowed to be only wood again. The yard stank of blood and smoke while silence draped the broken shields. Bjorn dropped to one knee, his breath ragged as grief. Bjorn said, "She gave her life to light this path, and we tread it with empty hands." Eirik laid his palm on the shattered torque, voice low. Eirik said, Astrid's sacrifice is carved in every breath we take. Liv's eyes lingered on the fire, shadow twisting across her face. Liv said, sacrifice binds, but it also chains the living to the dead. Bjorn looked skyward, eyes burning like coals in ash. Bjorn said, then let her chains hold us steady, not drag us down. The ravens wheeled above, carrying echoes of oaths not forgotten. By the gates, Sigvald lay bound in rope, his strength drained to husks of pride. Liv's gaze lingered, sharp with conflict. Liv said, spare him, and envy will return. End him, and envy may wear your name. Eirik said, no crown waits for me, only truth. Bjorn planted his shield in the ground like a stone. Bjorn said, his blood would ease wounds, but wounds heal slower with vengeance. Liv's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed thin as ice. Liv said, mercy is weakness, dressed as virtue. Eirik said, mercy is choosing to walk where he crawled. The gates groaned in the wind, and torches hissed with snowflakes. The hall burned low with tired torches, shadows weaving over carved beams. Eirik sat in the high seat, yet his shoulders carried no triumph. Bjorn said, the hall bows to you, yet you bow to nothing. Eirik said, I bow to truth, and it spares no man. Liv leaned against the post, eyes half closed with thoughts sharp as blades. Liv said, truth is brittle when fire eats the roof. Bjorn said, then let us rebuild with stone instead of ash. Eirik's hand rested on the scar across his jaw, his silence heavier than command. The gods seemed to whisper in the smoke, but no blessing came. By the fjord, the sky cracked with color, gold bleeding into blue. Eirik stood at the water's edge, his sword lowered into surf. Eirik said, the gods envied men, yet men envy peace more. Bjorn approached, his grin faint but unbroken. Bjorn said, peace is not given, it is carried. Liv lingered on the rocks, her voice quiet. Liv said, chains remain, even if crowns fall. Eirik said, then I will carry chains, not crowns. The tide pulled at the blade as if to claim it, but Eirik pulled back. The sea answered with foam, restless yet listening. Night returned with a sky filled by cold stars, their silence heavier than thunder. The hall lay in ruins, but the valley breathed freer. Eirik stood alone, voice a whisper. Eirik said, the envy of the gods breaks men, but men endure. Bjorn's laughter echoed faint, carried like memory. Bjorn said, we endure because we fight, not because we win. Liv's figure faded into shadow at the ridge, her silence cutting sharper than speech. The wind carried ash across the stones, a final hymn of sacrifice. Eirik's gaze fixed on the stars, and the night blinked with secrets unspoken.